Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For 27 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, alternative economics, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. This month, we'll have a warm and frank conversation with Larry Kerschner, whom I have known and respected for many years. Larry Kerschner is a Vietnam veteran who started working for peace and justice a few years after returning, and he's been accomplishing more and more ever since. Drawing upon his religious roots and his experience in the Army, Larry has developed himself into a wise, compassionate, and courageous peace activist who connects the dots between spiritual grounding and how to live actively and nonviolently in a world that is far different from what we want. Larry expresses his experiences, his values, and his analysis not only through peace activism in our local region, but also through traveling to other countries and through writing poetry. We'll make all of these linkages during this interview, and I'm happy to welcome my friend Larry Kerschner as our special guest during this hour. Good to have you here. Let's start, Larry, with something of your background. You grew up in Seattle, and you recently retired as a health professional in Lewis County. A lot happened in between. Let's take a look starting with your youth.
Well, like you said, I grew up in Seattle. I was one of 11 in our family. My mother was a good Catholic, and I graduated from O'Day High School in 1965 in Seattle and attended the University of Washington. Following that, I worked at the Seattle Times at the same time and spent a good year partying at the University of Washington, so that my grade point was pretty nil by the time I was done with that year. At the same time, I was married, and my marriage at that time was breaking up. So that left me without my student deferral, and the Selective Service selected me.
That's the draft.
Yes.
For people who don't know the name of the draft agency,
yeah.
The Selective Service is the
Right.
agency that runs the military draft.
Right. And so I was drafted in the summer of 1967. I didn't find out until years later. At that time, you got 30 days notice when you're drafted. And I didn't find out until they gave me 10 days notice, and I have no idea why. Didn't find out until years later that my ex-brother-in-law at the time had gone to the draft board in Seattle and told them specifically that I had lost my student deferral. And so they, I don't know what else he told them, but they hurried up the process. So I found myself in the Army.
Well, and you found yourself in Vietnam.
I was trained in the infantry and was sent to Vietnam on Thanksgiving Day, 1967. It was served with the 4th Division in the Central Highlands.
Can you tell us something of your most significant experiences in the Army there?
There were a lot of them, but probably the initial significant experience was I was probably there less than a week, maybe a week and a half, and I was a driver for armored personnel carriers at the time, and we were out on a patrol and came under fire, and I pulled into some tall grass, and there was a man hiding in the grass who I didn't see, but his body got caught in the treads of the track that's on each side of the armored personnel carrier, and it caused the track to slip off of the sprockets. So in the middle of that battle, I needed to get out of the armored personnel carrier, go down, undo the tread, lay it out, jockey the APC around, put the tread back on, and tighten it back up so we could go again. But in the process of this, I found what had happened was his head had actually gotten caught in the track, so it had crunched his head as it flipped it off there. So that's obviously something that still stays with me to this day.
Yeah, you wrote a poem in the book you published. You write a lot of great poetry, and this book, Gravelines, you published in 2013. You've got a poem based on that experience.
The way this poem came about was a group of us were doing counter-recruitment a number of years ago, and we developed a CD in which I asked 12 people, if you were giving advice to someone who was joining the military in 2 minutes, what would you tell them? And in fact, Glenn, you were the one non-military person on the CD. Yeah. So this is part of my answer to that question, and it's called Answering a Question. The first man I killed was small and hidden in the tall grass. Being a killer forever changes you. Even if you learn to be kind and considerate and civilized, that part of you is always there, hiding down inside, awaiting a chance. A normal person does not want to kill and will avoid it at all cost. The military won't allow you to remain normal. It doesn't matter if you think that you are smart enough not to get caught up in their lies. They will change you. Don't be sucked into the biggest myth and lie that killing and dying for your country is somehow heroic. Really be all that you can be.
So, later on during this interview, we'll talk in some more depth about lessons learned from experiences and so forth. But for right now, is there anything you want to mention about your experiences in the Army and Vietnam that might lay a foundation for something that we might talk about later?
Well, one of the first things after I was out of the military and long enough to get a little perspective on it, the thing that kept coming to me was the fact that our society could take a person, put them in a situation where you had to kill or be killed, and then when you come home, they tell you it's okay, that it was a good thing. And when I got a little perspective on it, to me that seemed in some ways the most horrendous thing that they could do to make killing okay.
Yeah,
it's hard to even describe how
to normalize that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. After returning from Vietnam, what did you do for the next couple of years, and then what were the sequential steps that started you connecting with the peace movement?
First 3 years after I got back, I moved to Alaska and did a couple of different jobs up there, but basically spent those 3 years self-medicating with alcohol and other drugs, and then discovered meditation and stopped using the drugs, and have been meditating now on and off for over 40 years. I didn't I paid attention to politics, but I really didn't get involved as an activist for quite a few years. It was a number of years later when my son turned about 11 or 12, and he read somewhere that he was going to have to sign up for selective service when he turned 18. And he said he wasn't going to do that. Yeah. And so we talked about, following the law or not following the law. So we looked into what you needed to do to substantiate your conscientious objector status. And one of the things that it was recommended was keep a record of various things that you do. So we lived in near Chehalis at the time, and there was a Catholic worker farm, a Bethlehem farm in Chehalis. So he started going there and working with the homeless people that were living there and learning things. And it was through the group, that people that were involved there, that I met my first members of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And through them, I joined WWFOR.
The Western Washington level of the FOR, yeah.
And became active in various things. And so it was actually through my son that I got re-involved in the issues, and have been active ever since.
Yeah, and for viewers who might not know Catholic Worker, that started out in the 30s, it's not a part of the institutional church, but the founders were devoted Catholics who were trying to link up their faith with direct egalitarian connections with poor people, homeless people, hungry people, people in need, and also working for peace and social justice and economic justice in a way that was quite different from any social service agency, because it was so egalitarian.
Right.
And then I remember those folks at the Bethlehem farm in
Dorothy
Chehalis.
Day and Peter Morin were the two who started it. And Dorothy Day, in her early years, was a communist, and then she converted to the Catholic Church, and she met Peter Morin, who was a monk, or I'm not sure exactly his status, but he was involved with the Catholic Church semi-officially, and they wanted to develop something to meet the needs of the poor people, this being during the Depression, that was an alternative to the Communist Party and the leftists of the time. And in fact, the newspaper, which is still published, is called The Catholic Worker, which was a play on the Communist Party newspaper of the time called The Daily Worker. So and they have a long history of being on the right side of most issues.
Or the left side, as the case may be.
As you would say.
Folks in Olympia might be aware of Bread and Roses, the Catholic Worker House in Olympia that started in early 80s and has been doing good work with homeless folks and others since. So you got connected with, through Bethlehem Farm, the Catholic Worker House in rural Chehalis, who happened to be involved with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. You then went on, you've been very active with the FOR, both at the Western Washington level and in Lewis County, where you are a key contact point for the
we
chapter
have the
there.
Fire Mountain chapter in Lewis County.
Named after Mount St. Helens. So more than a decade before George W. Bush launched his 2003 war against Iraq, his father, George H.W. Bush, had launched his own war against Iraq in 1990. Between these two wars, in 2000, you had traveled to Iraq with other peace activists. Why did you go to Iraq in 2000?
It was at the Spring Assembly in 1999.
It's a Western Washington annual event.
That I met Bert Sachs, who was planning I think at that time, his second trip to Iraq. And it was with a group called Voices in the Wilderness. And basically, it was a group to take medical supplies there. At the time, the United States, through the UN, had sanctions against the people of Iraq, which prevented medicine, food, a large number of basic humanitarian items from going there. I mean, they went so far as to prevent pencils for the children in the schools, because they had this theory that you could take the graphite out of the pencils and somehow make a radar-resisting weapon or something. So we went there in August of 2000. At that time, we were subject to 12 years in jail and a $500,000 fine from the government. I met Kathy Kelly, who was one of the founders of Voices in the Wilderness there. And I also met a gentleman named Alan Pogue, who introduced me to the Veterans for Peace, which is the other organization I'm involved with. And in fact, he gave me a cap that, while we were there, in Arabic on it, it has Arabic writing, which literally translates as Ancient Warriors for Peace.
So in 2002 and 2003, George W. Bush was pushing for another war against Iraq, and a nationally respected poet from Washington State, Sam Hamill, he lives out on the Olympic Peninsula, if I remember correctly, used poetry as a way to oppose the war. Tell us about that, and then follow up with a poem of your own.
Yeah. In January of 2003, Sam got a note from Barbara Bush. They were planning to do, or no, not Barbara, Laura Bush. They were planning to do a symposium at the White House looking at the poetry of Langston Hughes, Emily Dickinson, and Walt Whitman. And this note came about a week after Bush Jr. announced his plans for shock and awe bombing of the people of Iraq, in Baghdad in particular. And this reminded Sam so much of the firebombing in the Second World War of Dresden and some of the other places that he was aghast and decided he would not take part in that, and in fact decided he would do a counter poetry demonstration in front of the White House at the same time as the symposium was supposed to take place. So he sent an email to a couple of friends, and they sent it to friends, and pretty soon they had over 11,000 poems from various poets around the world that were anti-war poems, and this resulted in a book called Poets Against the War. And in 2006, he was the speaker at the Veterans for Peace conference in Seattle, and he read one of his poems, a poem called Eyes Wide Open, and I wrote this poem.
So this one that you're reading is
This is
yours.
my poem in reaction to his poem.
His, okay. Yes.
Eyes Wide Open. I heard Sam Hamill say the title of his poem as Lies Wide Open, but when he spoke of an olive-skinned girl peering from a photograph, I thought maybe he said, it lies wide open, like my broken heart, like possibilities, like the road to destruction, like the way of peace, like music playing in the night, like the door to the mosque, like the soldier's abdomen, like an unfinished hard luck story, like a beloved community, or maybe, he said, lies wide open, untruths all, like honeyed words dripping from the politician, like theological support for war, like uncomfortable liberals rocking the boat, unwilling to rock the boat, like propaganda called news, like support the troops, like freedom and democracy, like the American dream, like the bottom line, or maybe he meant eyes wide open.
Thank you. You've been very active with Veterans for Peace. Can you tell us how you connected with Veterans? You mentioned the story of meeting this one person there. Can you tell us what else you've done with Veterans for Peace, including like in late 2002 and early 2003, you helped with some organizing.
Yeah, like I say, I learned about Veterans for Peace there on that trip to Iraq and became a member. And sometime in the fall of 2002, WWFOR again called together a group of activists at Garfield High School in Seattle in order to look for ways to try to stop what looked like a coming war. And there were a lot of different groups, neighborhood groups, and I was asked to lead a group of veterans that were there. I think there was 2,000 people there, or 1,200. There was a large number of people there. And we had about 30 or 35 veterans who got together and discussed things and came up with a number of things we wanted to do, and one of which was to start a Western Washington chapter of Veterans for Peace. And that turned out to be Chapter 92, and it covered all of Western Washington. And it grew so large that it became unwieldy to try to hold meetings. So eventually other chapters budded off, and I was a founding member of the chapter in Olympia, Chapter 109, which is a Rachel Corrie chapter. And we also have chapters in Bellingham, in Tacoma, on the Olympic Peninsula. Seems like there's another one too. So a number of different Veterans for Peace chapters budded off of that and continue to be active today.
Yeah, well, the people can contact the Olympia one at through Dennis Mills,
Right.
At 360-867-1487, mills.dennis@comcast.net. Website for that is www.vfp109rcc.org, and the RCC part of that website is because it's the Rachel Corrie chapter. Right. The national level is www.veteransforpeace.org. So
there's 170 chapters around the country.
And they do a lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
And you continue to participate. We'll talk about that. In fact, the next thing we could talk about is you went with other Veterans for Peace members to Korea, South Korea, in 2006. What do the people of this country need to know about the Korean War from the early 50s?
That's the main thing they need to know, is that the Korean War never ended. There was an armistice to stop the fighting, but the war never officially ended. The Chinese left Korea in 1956, and we still have 23,000 troops occupying South Korea. In fact, I just read the other day that we're planning to send another 800 troops and 80 Abrams tanks to South Korea as part of President Obama's move to move the military to the Pacific, because China is obviously our new enemy. And so it's part of that restructuring of the military.
Yeah, you want to have a new enemy every few years. It helps keep the
good for business,
keep the military budget up, and keep the people afraid. Oh no, we got somebody else to be afraid of now. Yeah, so people really don't know that all we've got with Korea is a ceasefire and not really an official end to that. Or you and I did a program here in
2007.
November 2007. I had to look it up and get it in my notes here. November 2007, where you walked us through this fascinating history of U.S. military domination of Korea, going back many, 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 many years before that.
Yeah, we've managed to dominate, is a good word, the people of Korea through various political and military shenanigans since the late 1800s. And while I was there in the newspaper, there had been a recent poll, and it showed that 80% of the people of South Korea under the age of 30 wanted U.S. troops to leave. And their main concern was reunification with North Korea. The older people still had memories of the Korean War, so they weren't quite as willing to take that road. But they wanted most of the people there wanted the U.S. troops to leave. The reason we were there, the Veterans for Peace group, we'd been asked to come in solidarity and stand in solidarity with farmers in Pyeongtaek, which is a rice growing region in South Korea, where there was a large U.S. military base. And the Japanese had a base there in the 30s and 40s. And then when the U.S. troops came in, took over the base and doubled the size of the base in the late 40s, early 50s, and kicked hundreds of farmers off of their land because the base was in the middle of the rice growing area. So when we were there in 2006, I think in 2003, the decision was made to triple the size of the base again, and 3,000 farmers were being thrown off their land. So we were there to stand in solidarity with them and the veterans, the Korean Veterans for Peace group and other Korean activist groups.
Yeah, the people here need to know, I think, that the folks in these various countries that we were occupying or meddling in really don't want us there. They don't see us as saviors. They see us as burglars and oppressors.
Exactly.
And years ago, I used to read a publication called the Monthly Review of Korean Affairs. It was like a magazine that would come out every month with what was going on in Korea. None of this was in the U.S. press. Right. But they have the Korean CIA, which was doing what the U.S. CIA wanted it to do. And we were pulling the strings behind the various dictators that pretended that they were running a democracy, but it was really a dictatorship and suppressing people's civil rights, human rights, legal rights.
The first time they actually had a free election in South Korea was 1979.
Yeah, so. and we were pulling the strings all the way along up to, it's an amazing story. If people want to watch that interview with you about the Korean history, they can do it through the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation's website, www.olympiafor.org. Click TV programs and then scroll down to November 2007. It's a very informative program.
Yeah, and I recommend people watch it, not because I was on it, but because it's one of the major stories of the 20th century that very few Americans know anything about.
Yeah. You went to Afghanistan in 2009. Why did you go and what did you do?
A couple of friends from here in Olympia and I read that the leading cause of death for children in Afghanistan wasn't the war, it was dirty water. And we had been, through the internet, engaged with a group of young Afghan people who were known as the Afghan Peace Volunteers. So it would be an opportunity to visit them. So the three of us learned how to make a biosand water filter.
Yeah, it's very low tech.
Very low tech, no moving parts, nothing to break down. A cement box about a foot by a foot or by about 3 foot, filled with sand and gravel of a specific type, can take out 99.5% of all bacteria, viruses, and protozoa and worms out of the drinking water. And a box that size can provide enough water for a family. The only cost is the cost of the cement and the sand. So you're talking, $4 or $5 to produce a water filter that would be filtering water without maintenance for at least 50 years. So it's an elegant, low-cost, low-tech system that can solve a major problem, because dirty water is a global issue. So we learned this, and we went there and taught some villagers how to do that.
Yeah, so they can make you get the mold.
Right.
You
we
build
had a
the
mold.
concrete
We had
thing.
a mold made, a steel mold made, and then we left it with them so they could continue the process.
Yeah, and then use local sand and gravel of the right kinds of sizes to make it filter properly.
Yeah.
You wrote a poem about the Trident nuclear submarine base, which is yet another thing that you've been working on. And we'll have you read that in a second. For many years, you've been protesting against nuclear weapons up at the Trident nuclear submarine base at Bangor in Kitsap County, and you've been arrested there. Tell us something about that, and then if you can read the poem, that would be great.
The base there, I can't remember. It's been there 30 years?
Well, it was in the 70s.
Yeah.
The first Trident arrived in 82.
Right. Before,
and it was being built in the 70s.
Yeah, just as it was being built, there used to be large groups of protesters, so I understand, in the thousands.
Yeah, we had 3,000 of us at one point in about 1977 or 78.
Right, and now our protests are in the dozens rather than the thousands, but at least 3 times a year there's a significant presence there, blocking the roads, trying to get media coverage, trying to talk to the people on the base, just trying to make it known. this is, what, 80 miles from Seattle. They've got enough, each of the Trident submarine has enough D5 missiles that each one has 24 missiles. Each missile can be independently targeted to 8 different targets. So one submarine can blow up hundreds of cities around the world, and there's 8 of them there, 9 of them there, and this is just up the road, and a lot of people aren't aware of that.
Yeah, and a lot of people also aren't aware that an international court has ruled that the possession of nuclear weapons violates international law. But of course, in this country, we don't care about that because we're above international law. We're the United States.
To it.
Yeah,
yes.
And we'll talk about that later in the interview too.
So I've written a number of poems about being involved up there, and this one came to me. I can't remember when I wrote this, but it's called "On the Blight of Trident." Sea-launched nuclear depression, impressions of midnight dying, tears streaking the sky in your wake. Be gone, you black-hearted crime. Mad with fear, you react to your demons, reported, imagined, and mythological. Blind from birth, blind about life. Missile tubes carry homeless death. To fulfill your boredom, you think your dance shows guts and manliness, the moxie of the mutated American. You cannot see new possibilities beyond the angst of predatory tradition. There is no place for bursts of wonder. There is no place for the soft rhythm. Aboriginal dreams undreamed, wailing whales can dig Ahab, sink your ship of never say die. Subtitle beings sing the blues in the wake of your nuclear game of mutual assured destruction. Words are nothing to radioactive you. Nothing renews in your empty space. Morning stars crash lightly against first strike hatred you do not recognize within the skull of your unquestioned view. Carry urban death, crash the farmer's field, burn all the children you cannot see. Out unto the clear and distant horizon. Deadly melopeia of Hiroshima and Nagasaki screams through our childish history like the prow of your boat through Puget Sound. Approaching our dreadful, simple destiny, black hour of murder in the moonlight, detonation creates a bloody environment. Blast, thermal pulse, neutrons, X and gamma rays, radiation, electromagnetic pulse, ionization of the upper atmosphere, large amounts of dust and radioactive fallout as the glowing bodies crumple to the floor, erotic fireballs warm your lunatic heart.
So this is another one from your book called Grave Lines, and that was published in 2013, and people can actually order it by contacting you at Larry
at peacepoet.me.
At peacepoet.me. So, and if people want to connect with the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action up next to the Trident base, they can visit www.gzcenter.org.
Right. Each year, Martin Luther King celebration, Mother's Day, and the Hiroshima and Nagasaki Day, they have a witness up there.
And they have other activities going on from time to time, and there are lawsuits and there's other stuff going on. In 2011, you went back to Vietnam. This time it was voluntary.
Right.
Tell us why you went and what you did there.
I was given the opportunity to go back with a group of other veterans and a couple of people who work for VA, Veterans Administration, as counselors. And it's something that I had been thinking about for a number of years. And a soldier, former soldier named John Fisher, contacted me and asked me if I would be interested in going. It was through a group called Soldier's Heart that organized the trips there. So it seemed like it was time to do that, and we were there for about 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm. So it was the related to your participation there before.
Yeah,
but from
when I was
different
there
approach.
initially, I was basically in the Central Highlands in a fairly small area, occasionally wandering off into Cambodia, despite what Richard Nixon said. And this time we started in Hanoi and went to Da Nang and down the coast, and then up to the Central Highlands, and then down to Ho Chi Minh City, and then out to the Mekong Delta. So we saw a lot more of the country this time than I had seen the original.
Yeah, and nobody's shooting at you this time.
And nobody was shooting
and you
at
weren't
us.
shooting at anybody else.
In fact, John is a chiropractor, and I had my background, and so we did a series of medical clinics for Agent Orange victims. And at one of them, there was a group of North Vietnamese soldiers there to get treatment who all were in the Central Highlands at the same time as John and I were.
Whoa.
So likely 40 years before, we were shooting at each other, and now here we were as friends and comrades, sharing some, it was, you couldn't have asked for a better time. In fact, when we got down to the Central Highlands, both John and I were able to find the spots where we had been wounded, and were able to do a little closure ceremony. I wrote a poem and did some incense, and it was a good way for me to close a number of issues related to the time there.
In the fall of 2013, you went to India with Bernie Meyer, who's been a guest on our program several times, including our March 2014 program. It was Bernie's 13th trip to India, where he would go as Gandhi in character, in dress, and try to convey Gandhi's message to the modern India. And you went with him on this trip, and you spent more than a month there.
Yeah,
you
35
had
days.
lots and lots of speaking engagements and things. And people were asking you, about your background. What kinds of things would you tell people?
Well, before I left, I told my friends how cool it was going to be to wander around India with Gandhi. So that was a good way to go. I actually went there expecting to accompany Bernie and wasn't really planning to talk particularly, but it came up and then it kept coming up again, and so I was able to. Bernie would present Gandhi, the historic Gandhi. Then he would do a presentation of Gandhi's thoughts about current issues, what he thinks Gandhi would say. And then I was able to do a presentation about how I started as a soldier in Vietnam, my years of meditation and thinking about these issues, and my time as a peace activist. And I was able to talk to a number of young people about how I went from one to the other, and the things that I thought were important in life in order to make that kind of a transition.
And people were able to connect.
I think
you
we had
with the
some
people,
language problems. We didn't speak Hindi. In some places we didn't have a translator, but most places there was somebody there who could speak English. We did, I think, 30 days in a row. We did from 1 to 3 presentations every day at either high schools or universities. So it was good.
Yeah. For the last few minutes, we've been talking about your travels to different parts of the world. As a human being, you've also traveled a lot from where you started to where you are now, just within your own self. Would you tell us some more about your development along the way, lessons you've learned, insights you've gained during more than 4 decades now of moving through a lot of peace and personal activities?
Yeah, how could you say what you learned in 40 years in 2 minutes? But some of the things I've learned is most people do the best they can. I think that's something that we need to give people credit for. I've learned that America is not exceptional, despite what the powers that be would have us believe. We stumble and fall just like every other country and empire in history. I've learned I think that the way people learn as children affects who they become later on. I read something recently that said children as young as 36 hours old will mimic the face of the people that they see. And the human brain is unique in the sense that what the human brain can do that a computer can't do is see a pattern and connect the dots. A computer isn't able to do that. So I think even at a very early age, we learn to connect the dots with other people and start taking that information into ourselves. And I think that's how people develop empathy and are able to learn to put themselves in the place of other people. And I think that the people in this world who are making a real difference, not the politicians, but the people who are able to organize people, activists, who are able to affect their community positively, are the people who have developed that sense of empathy. So I think that's an important thing that needs to be looked at.
When we were on the phone preparing for this conversation, you told me a story about a conversation in a hallway at the University of Washington. And could you share that story with us?
You know, after doing this for a number of years, there are times when you think, why in the world am I doing this? Nobody's paying a single bit of attention to what I'm doing, and I'm not making any difference at all. Not long after I came back from the trip to Iraq, I was at the University of Washington to see a speaker there. And before the lecture, I was standing in the hallway telling someone else about what we had done in Iraq, what we had seen, what our trip was about. And about a year and a half later, a young woman came up to me, and she said she had been standing behind me when I was doing that. I didn't know who she was or that she was there, but she heard what I said, and what I said so affected her that she was a student at Seattle University. She changed, a graduate student, she had changed her major and got involved in the anti-sanctions movement just because of what she heard me say. So to me that says you always have to do what you think should be done, whether you're seeing any results or not, because you never know when you're having an effect.
Yeah.
So it keeps me going in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it reminds me of something I heard decades ago that I think is valid, is that you can't control or know in advance what the ripple effects will be, but the obligation we have is to be faithful to doing the right thing now and then trust that the results can happen. We can't control those results, but we can at least control what we do.
Yeah, Dorothy Day, of that Catholic worker that we talked about earlier, she used to say, we're here to do the work, not to see the results.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Is there something else you could mention about the spiritual development we've done beyond what we've said?
Yeah,
I know compassion is an important part of...
I grew up as a Catholic, and I thought that, and I still think that social justice teaching of the Catholic Church is important. But I saw so much hypocrisy, around that I didn't follow the Catholic Church after my teen years. And I got into meditation, several different types of meditation, Indian meditation, and that helped me develop some spiritual ideas. There was a period of time for about 5 years when I was a pretty fundamentalist, Jesus-freak Christian, speaking in tongues and doing all that, and ultimately found that not very intellectually satisfying, and spent a number of years studying Buddhism. And I like a lot of the ideas about Buddhism. And I find that the older I get, questions like, God or death, those kinds of questions don't mean much to me. They become less and less relevant. The relevant questions have to do with interactions with other people, one-to-one. I found, it's my belief that and this is part of what I told the kids in India, you need to look within yourself and honestly look at yourself and look at the good and the bad and accept who you are, really know who you are. And it's only when you do that that you can find that place of truth within yourself. That gives you a place to stand, and by which you can then look at other people, and with empathy, using your place of truth, you can understand other people, not judge them, but you can understand other people, and it gives you a way to start the dialogue that we all need.
Yeah.
So I think the spirituality has to do with how you interact with other people. Yeah. The overriding questions that you can't know the truth for, God and those kinds of things, are less and less relevant.
Yeah, compassion. When we were talking on the phone to prepare for the program, you found, you mentioned how compassion is kind of a grounding element. We've talked some about lessons learned along the way. One of these is a lesson that we want the American people and the U.S. government to learn, and that's that militarism does not solve problems. And that notion at the military scale or at the individual stand your ground and shoot the other person scale has often been called the myth of redemptive violence. It's what you see at the end of movies when there's the big shootout, whether it's on Main Street in an old Western or blowing up things at the end of a other movie or whatever. But the notion that violence will solve the problems is a myth.
And it's an obvious myth, because look around. America's, according to Martin Luther King, America's the most violent government country in the world, and that was in 1968. It hasn't changed any. If violence were to solve the issues of the day, we would have a peaceful world.
Yeah, we've certainly devoted enough resources to violence and tried it enough times.
Look around. The more and more, there's more destruction, there's more chaos, there's more violence, and each one of those propounds more of the same. So, like I say, if the military could solve the problems, we would have a peaceful world.
I worked for some decades for the state government, and in my job we used to have to interact with people from other state agencies, and often we'd have some disagreement where my agency wants to do something and some other agency has a different idea about what should be done. And I should have said during a staff meeting sometime, well, let's get a bunch of guns and go over there to that agency and start shooting people until they do things our way.
Right.
But I never mentioned that. Nobody else ever mentioned that. Somehow we had better sense then to think that would solve the problem of the disagreement with the other state agency. But we get this all the time at the national level, and it's so much in our culture through the movies and through all that. It's a cultural thing, and other countries don't seem as much plagued by this as we do.
I think
they have a more rounded sense of what their history has been.
Some countries. I think the countries. I personally think capitalism is a major issue leading to that. Capitalism is designed to use up resources, including people, and doesn't care about the workers. And I think that the general feeling around all of that issue leads to violence, because people live in fear of want, or fear of their neighbor, or fear of losing their job, or fear of somebody out there going to get them. And I think all of that comes out of the capitalist approach to the world. I think if you look at the issues today globally, we for the future we have our choice between the global market and the global civil society, and those are the two directions. We can go one or the other, and unfortunately we seem to be picking the one which is not the peaceful one.
So besides the myth of redemptive violence, then there's also this myth that the U.S. empire
Right.
is somehow just or inevitable or good for the people
Right.
that we're
Yeah.
using
we're,
up.
We're taught consciously and unconsciously that Americans are exception to all the rules of history
Yeah.
because we're somehow picked by God to save the world.
Yeah.
But we're an empire like every other empire, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire.
Well, and every empire saw itself as the most wonderful
Right.
possible thing. The Romans thought that they were like, boy, we're so great, you know, we got the best civilization. But the Greeks had thought that right before that, and the Egyptians before that,
Chinese empires,
and the Soviet Union
Right.
thought that during, and
Right.
the Nazis had that. Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
Third Reich will last 1,000 years, and we're the supreme
Right.
race as Germans. I mean, every empire deludes itself in order to allow itself to be an empire.
There's a Norwegian historian named Johan Galtung who in the late 80s did an analysis of the Soviet Empire, and he concluded in, 1989, I think, that the Soviet Empire would collapse within, or no, when did that happen? 1980,
Yeah.
that the Soviet Empire would collapse within 10 years.
Yeah.
And it was 9 years and 10 months it was collapsing.
Yeah.
Well, he did a similar analysis of the United States in 2000, and he concluded that the American empire would collapse by 2025. And after 8 years of George Bush, he revised his prediction and said that the U.S. American empire will collapse by 2020.
Yeah. And this is a bipartisan empire that we have,
right,
so it
right,
kind of doesn't
yeah.
matter who's in the White House,
it
doesn't
makes
matter who
no
runs
difference.
Congress.
Yeah.
The policies are basically the same,
Right, exactly.
and
They're not
hastening.
people oriented. They're business oriented.
It's all business.
Profit
and
is
military.
the main generator.
Yeah, yeah. Instead of empire and militarism as the goal and the method, would compassion be a better goal and method? Or
I think,
what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think compassion, obviously, if people can learn to develop compassion. I think as a political idea, anarchism is something that people should be looking at. Now, I know when most people think of anarchism, the first thing they think of is disorder and violence and chaos. But if you think about the American empire, what do we have? Anarchism, the basic tenet of anarchism is the belief that people don't require someone in authority to tell them what to do in order for them to do the correct thing.
Yeah, it's been maligned.
Exactly.
And some people have taken it off into bad directions, but there's a lot of
And
good
it's
stuff.
possible, yeah.
Basically,
the idea of democratic anti-authoritarian movements is what needs to happen and has happened. I mean, if you think about in computers, the open source, that's a democratic anti-authoritarian thing. Fellowship or reconciliation, food not bombs, all of those kinds of issues are people rising up to see a need, not requiring authority to tell them to do it. So I think we need more and more of that. People are anarchists without calling themselves anarchists.
Right. Well, the Catholic worker movement is
Catholic
part of that.
worker,
Because
exactly.
they have never incorporated to make themselves a 501c3 for tax-deductible donations. They just do what they need to do because it's the right thing to do.
Right. And that's the kind of decentralized, powerful movement that the government can't put in jail.
Right.
I mean, there's no target for them. So I think ask what do we need? That's what we need.
How would you like the American people to function so as to move our whole society toward freedom from empire, freedom from militarism, toward better solutions? It's a grassroots thing. So what would be those first steps that people can do to make some leverage to move things along?
The first thing is every individual needs to find that place of truth within themselves, because until you have a place of truth to stand, you're going to be willy-nilly with the winds of whatever's coming by. If you know what's truth and you're able to speak truth to those who are around you, then you know, that's the first thing that needs to be done.
Yeah.
We need to recognize that the purpose of the educational system is to keep people from thinking.
Right. Well, and more so in the last few years when it's all been on testing instead of problem solving and analysis and creativity. Some of the groups that we've mentioned are good sources to get people started. I want to plug the websites for you mentioned Veterans for Peace. That's www.veteransforpeace.org. In the greater Olympia area, the Veterans for Peace Chapter 109, the Rachel Corrie chapter, is at www.vfp109rcc.org. Dennis Mills is the contact at 360-867-1487. The national level of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which has been around since 1914 in Europe, 1915 in the U.S., and has opposed every war for practically 100 years now, is at www.forusa.org, and then at the Western Washington level, www.wwfor.org, and then the Seattle phone number for our office up there is 206-789-5565. We'll include the Olympia FOR phone and website in our closing credits. Do you have a brief thought, and then we'll wrap this thing up?
Basically, people need to learn to be honest with themselves and look at the good and the bad, because we all have good and bad, and not judge each other negatively or positively. Just accept each other as human beings. And that if enough of us do that, we can create a society that's based on justice and humanity.
Great, thanks, Larry. We've been talking with one person who started out in a fairly ordinary way as a young person, paid attention to his experiences, reached out and learned a lot, stretched his spiritual grounding, and took a variety of risks to act boldly for peace and social justice. Larry Kerschner is not the only person who can do this. He's just the only person on the show that we're talking with during this hour. But every human being has the potential to continue experiencing, learning, and sticking our necks out to act for peace and other worthy goals. Some people do this by interacting with people in other nations around the world. Other people do it in their own local communities. Nobody can do everything, but each of us can do something, and most of us can do a lot more than we already have. This work is really satisfying, and you get to meet nice folks like Larry. You can get information about a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093, www.olympiafor.org. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it, and the world needs exactly what you have to offer. Thanks.